What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy walks straight into a pit of daytime TV hosts who think they can corner him? The answer is television chaos at its finest. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really caused Clint Eastwood to completely lose it on live television. Clint Eastwood, the man who built his career on silence that cut sharper than words and a glare that could freeze anyone in their tracks, stepped onto The View for what should have been a polite promotional interview. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and the audience was buzzing. But no one could have predicted the showdown that was about to unfold. This wasn't going to be another friendly chat with a Hollywood icon. This was about to turn into one of the most explosive confrontations daytime television had ever seen. Whoopi Goldberg, in her usual smooth tone, beamed at the crowd and welcomed their guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Clint Eastwood," she announced as the audience erupted in applause. Eastwood, calm and composed, gave a polite nod before settling into his chair, his weathered hands steady on the armrests, his voice carrying that familiar, gravelly authority. "Thank you for having me," he said. The questions began light and professional, Whoopi asking about his new project and what drew him to the story. Eastwood responded with the same thoughtful poise that had defined his decades-long career. "It's about second chances," he explained, his tone reflective. "Sometimes people deserve another shot at redemption, even when the world has written them off." Sarah Haynes leaned forward, clearly captivated, praising the theme and asking how he chooses his projects at this stage of his life. Eastwood's response was simple but profound. "I look for truth. Stories that reveal something real about the human condition. Hollywood already has enough fantasy." The audience hung on every word, enthralled by the quiet wisdom of a man who had shaped cinema for generations. For several minutes, the conversation flowed naturally. Eastwood discussed his directing process, his experiences working with actors, and his constant search for stories that carried real meaning. The audience was locked in, the other hosts nodding along respectfully, except for one. Joy Behar sat silently, her eyes gleaming, her smile just a little too knowing. She was biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, without warning, she cut in. "Clint, can I ask you something?" she said, her tone carrying an edge that instantly shifted the energy in the room. Eastwood turned to her, steady and unflinching, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Which comments would those be, Joy?" he asked. Joy leaned forward with mock sweetness, her words dripping with accusation. "Oh, your support for certain politicians who shall remain nameless, but who've made questionable statements about women and minorities." The room seemed to freeze. Whoopi shot Joy a sharp look, but the damage was done. The mood had changed. Eastwood's reply was calm but razor sharp. "I don't recall making any statements that disparaged women or minorities," he said evenly, that familiar steel creeping into his tone. Joy smirked, pressing harder. "But don't you think your political endorsements send a message by association?" she prodded, clearly enjoying herself. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the crew hesitating behind the cameras, and the once bubbly audience was now dead silent, sensing that the interview had veered into dangerous waters. Eastwood leaned back in his chair, fixing Joy with a stare that could cut glass. "Young lady, I've been in this business since before you were born," he said firmly. "I've worked with people of every background, every political persuasion, and I judge them by their character, not their party affiliation." Joy's face flushed, her voice rising with indignation. "Excuse me, but I think I have every right to ask tough questions of my guests," she shot back. Eastwood didn't blink. His voice stayed calm, but there was a dangerous undertone that electrified the room. "And I have every right not to answer gotcha questions from someone who's more interested in manufacturing controversy than having a real conversation." The exchange landed like a thunderclap. Joy bristled, her cheeks reddening further as she snapped, "Gotcha questions? I'm asking about your public statements, Clint. That's called journalism." Eastwood let out a low chuckle, the kind that wasn't remotely amused. "Is that what we're calling it now?" he asked dryly. "Because in my day, journalism involved facts and research, not fishing expeditions." Whoopi desperately tried to steer things back. "Let's maybe get back to talking about your film," she urged, But Joy wasn't finished, not even close. "No," she said firmly. "I think this is important. You can't just expect softball questions when you've made controversial statements." "What about that empty chair stunt at the convention?" she asked smugly, smirking as if she had landed her knockout punch. The air in the studio turned heavy. Even the crew stopped moving, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. Eastwood tilted his head slightly, his eyes locked on Joy. "You mean when I used a metaphor to make a point about political accountability?" he replied calmly. "Yes, I remember. What about it?" Joy pushed harder, her grin widening. "Don't you think it was a little, unhinged?" she asked, savoring the word. The tension was unbearable. The audience sat frozen, every eye glued to the exchange. Eastwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to that whisper that carried more menace than any shout could. "Joy, let me ask you something. How many films have you made?" Joy blinked, caught off guard. "What does that have to do with anything?" she demanded. Eastwood's eyes never wavered. "Just answer the question. How many films have you directed, produced, or starred in?" Joy stammered, defensive. "That's not the point. I'm a television host and comedian." Eastwood pressed on, relentless. "And how many Academy Awards have you won?" Joy's voice climbed in pitch. "Again, that's not relevant," she said, clearly rattled. Eastwood leaned back slightly, his tone sharpening like a blade. "How many careers have you launched? How many actors have you given their first break? How many stories have you told that meant something to people?" Joy's attempted confidence faltered. "I entertain people every day on this show," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Eastwood tilted his head, almost curious. "Do you? Or do you just ambush guests and create drama for ratings? Is that your idea of entertainment?" Sarah Haynes, sensing the storm brewing at the table, quickly tried to break the tension. "Clint, your films have entertained millions of people all over the world. What's been the most rewarding part of your career?" she asked with a nervous smile, clearly hoping to pull the conversation back to safer ground. Eastwood turned his head toward her, softening slightly for a brief moment, but the steel in his eyes didn't fade. "You know what, Sarah? I'll answer that," he said firmly, his voice steady but carrying weight. "The most rewarding part has been working with professionals, people who understand that respect is earned, not demanded, people who know how to have a conversation instead of ambushing their guests with cheap shots." The audience murmured, stunned by the pointed jab. Joy's face flushed even redder, her mouth falling open as if she couldn't quite believe the words had been said on live television. "Cheap shots?" she snapped, her voice shaking with fury. "I'm asking legitimate questions about your political views, Clint." Eastwood's expression didn't budge. If anything, his calm made the moment even more unnerving. "No," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "You're not asking questions. You're trying to manufacture a viral moment. That's not journalism. It's theater. And it's not very good theater at that." The crowd gasped, and even the crew behind the cameras exchanged stunned looks. Joy, her confidence slipping, leaned forward. "I'm doing my job," she barked, her tone defensive now rather than authoritative. Eastwood didn't flinch. "Your job is to talk with your guests about why they're here. I came to discuss a film I poured my heart into, a story about redemption and second chances. But instead, you've dragged us into political mud because you'd rather make headlines than have a real conversation." Whoopi raised her hands, desperate to regain control. "The film does sound fascinating, Clint. Could you tell us more about the main character?" she asked, her tone pleading. Eastwood turned his head toward her, but his eyes never left Joy, and his words landed like a warning shot. "It's about a man who's made mistakes," he said, his voice low but powerful. "A man who's trying to do better, to grow beyond his past. But sometimes, the biggest obstacles aren't the ones in front of you. They're the people who refuse to let you move forward, people who want to keep you trapped by your past because it benefits them." The metaphor hit the room like a hammer. Everyone understood what he meant, and the meaning wasn't lost on Joy, whose clenched jaw gave her away. "That's a beautiful message," Sarah interjected quickly, trying once more to bring light back into the room. "Redemption is such a powerful theme in storytelling." But Joy wasn't willing to let it end there. Her eyes gleamed as she leaned forward again. "Speaking of redemption, Clint," she said smugly, "don't you think some people are beyond it? When someone consistently supports divisive politics, at what point do we stop giving them chances? The audience stiffened again, sensing the return of the clash. Eastwood's jaw tightened just slightly, his voice dropping to that menacing quiet everyone recognized from his films. "Are we talking about the character in my film, or are you trying to make this personal again?" Joy gave her sweetest smile, though her tone dripped with venom. "I'm talking about accountability. Public figures have a responsibility to their fans." Eastwood's reply came like a whip crack. "Do they now?" he asked, his voice still calm but with a dangerous edge. "And what responsibility do television hosts have to their guests?" Joy fired back instantly, her words sharp and smug. "To ask the tough questions that matter," she declared, convinced she had cornered him. But Eastwood leaned in, his stare unshakable, his tone sharp as steel. "No, their responsibility is to treat people with basic human decency, something you seem to have forgotten." The studio erupted into hushed whispers, the tension thick enough to slice through. Whoopi frantically signaled to the producers, her face betraying panic, while Sarah looked down at her notes, clearly wanting to disappear. Joy, however, seemed almost gleeful at the confrontation, convinced she was finally striking a blow. But then she crossed a line. Her voice rose as she laughed harshly. "Human decency? That's rich coming from someone who spent decades playing violent characters and glorifying gun culture." The studio audience audibly gasped, some putting their hands over their mouths. Even for The View, this was a shocking accusation. Eastwood leaned back, studying Joy for a long, piercing moment. He didn't need to raise his voice. The silence around him gave his words more power. "You know what your problem is, Joy," he said finally, his tone calm but deadly. She crossed her arms, smirking. "Enlighten me," she said sarcastically. Eastwood's eyes narrowed. "You think being loud makes you right. You think being confrontational makes you brave. But all it really makes you," he paused deliberately, his stare locked on hers, "is a bully hiding behind a microphone." Joy's voice pitched high, shrill and defensive. "Excuse me, did you just call me a bully?" The crowd winced at the sound. Eastwood didn't break his gaze. "You heard me," he said, his voice even lower now, colder. "You sit here day after day taking shots at people who can't fight back because they're guests on your show. You think that makes you powerful, but it doesn't. It just makes you small." The words hit like a gunshot. Joy's face turned crimson as she shot to her feet. "How dare you call me small? I've been doing this job for years. I've interviewed presidents, celebrities, world leaders," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. Eastwood cut her off with icy precision. "And how many of them left here feeling like they'd been treated with respect? How many of them walked away thinking they had a real professional interview?" The silence from the audience said it all. Joy sputtered, struggling to form words. "I don't have to take this from you, or anyone else," she shrieked. Eastwood leaned back calmly, the picture of composure. "You're absolutely right," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "You don't have to take anything from me, and I don't have to sit here and let you turn what should have been a conversation about art into your personal political theater." Whoopi's voice cut through the chaos, her tone desperate. "Clint, Joy, maybe we should all just take a breath here." But Eastwood had already made up his mind. Slowly, he stood, his presence towering over the table, his voice calm yet commanding. "No, Whoopi. I think Joy and I understand each other perfectly now." The entire studio held its breath. Joy's chest rose and fell as she glared up at him, her voice trembling with rage. "You can't just walk out of an interview because you don't like the questions," she shouted, her tone desperate, as though sheer volume could win the battle. Eastwood didn't flinch. He gave her that famous squint, the one audiences had seen 1,000 times in his films, and replied with deadly calm, "Watch me." The silence that followed was crushing. Every person in the studio, hosts, crew, audience, felt the weight of the words. Eastwood leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering into that whisper that carried more power than any shout. "I came here as a courtesy, to talk about something I care about. I didn't come here to be your punching bag of the day." The statement landed like a hammer, leaving Joy sputtering in disbelief. "This is live television," she barked, almost pleading now. "You can't just leave." Eastwood's reply was instantaneous, his tone razor sharp. "Can I?" he asked, his hand already moving toward the microphone clipped to his shirt. That's the thing you don't understand, Joy. Real power isn't about cornering someone on live TV. Real power is knowing when to walk away. He paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Joy, red-faced and trembling, tried one last desperate attempt. "If you walk out now, Clint, you'll look like you can't handle tough questions." But Eastwood turned to the main camera, his expression calm, his tone steady. "Folks watching at home, I came here to talk about a film that means something to me. Instead, I walked into an ambush. That tells you everything you need to know about the state of television today." The studio gasped. Even the producers froze behind the glass, realizing this was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning. Eastwood then turned back to Joy, his stare unrelenting. "As for handling tough questions, lady, I've been handling them since before you even knew what a microphone was. The difference is, they were usually asked by professionals." Joy's face turned a deeper shade of crimson, her voice breaking as she lashed out. "You arrogant has-been! You think you can come on my show and insult me?" The words hung in the air like poison, and the reaction was immediate. The audience recoiled, the co-hosts looked horrified, and even the crew members shifted uncomfortably. Eastwood paused, his eyes narrowing, and repeated her words softly. "Has-been." He let the insult linger before delivering the killing blow. That's an interesting choice coming from someone whose biggest accomplishment is sitting at a table talking about other people's accomplishments. The studio fell silent. The moment was suffocating. Even Joy seemed stunned by the force of the response. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but the energy in the room crackled with finality. He leaned down slightly, his voice dropping into that iconic whisper audiences had heard in countless westerns. "You know, Joy, in all my years I've been called many things, but usually by people who had achieved something themselves." The words gutted her. Her defiance wavered, her voice trembling as she tried to reply, but nothing came out. She was cornered, and everyone watching knew it. Whoopi tried one last time, her voice quivering with urgency. "Clint, maybe we can start over. Joy, maybe you should apologize so we can get back to the film." But Eastwood shook his head, unfastening his microphone and placing it gently on the table. "No, Whoopi, I think we're done here." He straightened his jacket, standing tall, his presence commanding the room. This was supposed to be about art, about storytelling, about redemption. Instead, it turned into a circus. His eyes cut back to Joy one last time. And every circus has its clown. The audience erupted into a collective gasp, the most shocking sound yet. Joy's jaw dropped, her face frozen in disbelief as Eastwood delivered the line that would be replayed for years. He stepped back from the table, his boots echoing against the studio floor, and looked into the camera one final time. For those watching at home, remember this: real conversation is about respect. When you stop respecting your guests, you stop respecting your audience. With that, he turned his back on the panel and walked toward the studio doors. The audience burst into spontaneous applause, some even standing to cheer as if they were witnessing a scene from one of his films. Joy sat motionless, her face a mask of humiliation, her authority shattered in front of millions. The other hosts stared down at the table, unable to defend her, knowing the damage was irreparable. As the doors closed behind Clint Eastwood, the image burned itself into television history. The man who built his legend on grit and unshakable resolve had just delivered a demolition with words sharper than any bullet. And Joy Behar, who had entered the moment believing she could land a knockout blow, was left exposed, humiliated, and defeated in her own house. The studio audience would never forget it. The viewers at home would replay it endlessly, and the headlines the next morning would all say the same thing. Clint Eastwood walked into the View and walked out having proven, once again, that he's still the fastest draw in Hollywood. Only this time, his weapon was truth.